Hi, Jeremy. This is an assessment of the survey report for 77 Harley Street. So I've gone through the report earlier and I've highlighted points of interest. And with that in mind, let's get through it. So as I go, I'll just give general commentary and then I'll dwell upon the points of note. So here's the general introductory comment, who's done it, etc., as you know, and their overall opinion. And surveyor thinks it was a reasonable purchase. That's good. There's a few issues which we'll talk about. Thinks it was reasonable at 152. That's good. And then he highlights some of the issues. And then we get into the energy efficiency stuff. That's a whole topic unto itself. But this property should be relatively energy efficient. And one of the points to note here is that it's a cavity wall. And the reason I know that is because of the way the bricks are laid out. So you don't have joining bricks. And if it's a cavity wall, that's a good thing. It just means it's more energy efficient and so on. So that's a small positive point. Anyway, getting back into it. He talks about this chimney stack as an issue, and he couldn't see it, and he doesn't know if it exists, and therefore it's some kind of safety issue. I'm not quite clear on why it's a safety issue. If there are no fires in the open fires in the property, and from memory there aren't any. Bear with me, I'll pause and I'll be back in a second. Okay, back. And here are the sales particulars. So far, no open fires. And so for me, the only question is whether it's actually, oops, okay, I'll get this, I'll be right back. Back. Okay, so based on these photographs of the overall interior, there are no open fireplaces. So therefore, I'm not really clear on why it's a safety issue. And therefore, I would ignore that comment, honestly. And let's just go back here. If there were fireplaces and there was no chimney pot, then there would be a safety problem. But no fireplaces, so no safety problem. And the next thing is the roof. The roof seems to be in reasonable condition. That's good. Clay tiles, by the way, just to say, they are generally quite good. I quite like clay tiles because if a tile breaks, you can just slot the tile, you can slot the tile back in, a new tile back in. You don't have to do what's known as tingling, which is where you have a strip of aluminium, you curl it up, and it's just all a bit of a mess. But this, it's all straightforward. So anyway, it's a relatively new roof, and the reason we know this is coming up a little later on. All right, let's carry on through this. And he just makes various comments about the property. That's all good. And brickwork looks good. Nice to see we've got damp-proof coursing in there, and there are no signs of damp anywhere. So, well, there are some signs of damp, but they're not excessive, which is good. But the fact that it's had relatively recent damp proofing, or I assume anyway, is a good thing. Okay, and moving on. So he talks about the windows. Yes, a lot of the windows have blown, and this is shown here. So it's that old story where the seals have gone and you get condensation building up and so on. Now, fortunately, it's a really straightforward job to deal with. These windows are modular, so you don't need to replace the windows. All you've got to do is pop out the clips surrounding the windows, get the panes out, put new panes back in. So Joe or whoever it is that would be dealing with the renovation on this, they would handle that process. It's very straightforward. And new glass panes, I don't know exactly what it costs, but it's in the order of like £120 a pane or something like that. It's not that much. And what I think happened with this property was they were sold bad double glazing in the first place and the seals went. Because quite often I see properties which are quite old with old double glazing that's doing fine. The surveyor talks about a 10 to 15 year lifespan for these things, which I suppose if it's bad double glazing. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. It's just another thing to deal with. Now this is important and it's good. So it's got felt underneath the roof tiles. Now I'm sure we talked about another property where there was no felt underneath. And what that tells me is a couple of things. One is that it's relatively modern. So this was probably done in the last 40 years or something like that. The fact that the felt is there, that's all good. And the roofing all seems to be in reasonable condition. He talks about a gap between here and the next house and describes that as an issue. In theory it is, but in practice it's not much of an issue because it doesn't threaten the mortgageability of the property because there is a clear wall partitioning the two buildings, and therefore you don't have risk of theft, and it does reduce fire risk. But he's just being cautious, so that's fine. He also says plasterboard ceilings. Again, this is a good sign. So originally, when this property was built, it was plaster and lath, and it's quite rare to see this, so it's worth dwelling upon this for a minute. And this was pre-stud wall, and the way they do it is they have strips of wood with a bit of a span between it, and then they would plop the plaster on and skim it down and make it flat. But these surfaces were never particularly flat, and also over time, because they were so kind of fragile, I suppose you could say, they were prone to cracking and crumbling. And so when a property has plasterboard, what it means is that sometime in the last 40, 60 years or whatever, the whole place was just completely pulled apart. All of that old plaster and lath was removed, or virtually all of it, and it was made good with more modern plasterboard, which is flat and easy to repair and just generally gives a nicer finish. So that's good. So it's a fundamentally okay property that has had some genuine love and attention over the last however many years. So general pictures of the property. Now he shows you some damp readings. Generally they're okay. There are a couple of elevated moisture readings. Now with these protometers, if the marker is like right at the top, then it's really wet, and if it's at the bottom it's really dry, and this is just slightly elevated, so it's not actually a concern to me anyway. Here's an example of a really low reading, but I would argue that he hasn't actually got a reading because he's just, maybe it's oil-based paint, and the way they work is that you have an electric current going between the two, and it works out moisture readings that way. And if the electric current can't travel, maybe it, I don't know. Anyway, it's very unusual to see zero. That's my point. Because that would mean that there's less humidity than there is in the air, which is unlikely. Anyway, that's fine. Then he talks about the suspended floor, and I think he's basically saying it's an issue because he can't see what's going on, so therefore he has to say there's an issue. But overall, he did the bounce test. He made a comment about this, and said that the floor was solid and there wasn't any real creaking and everything's level and so on. So this is all good. As I said, he can't see in, so he has this descriptive picture, but that's not relevant. And then he just talks about the various fittings, and there's an extractor. And okay, so there is an issue here, but it's not really an issue. if that makes sense. Well, it might be an issue. It depends on, well, let's talk about it and you'll decide if it's an issue or not. So, so stairs are dangerous because you can fall down them, and therefore there are building regulations which say that, for example, banisters being this is a banister here, this thing has to be 900 high, but also there has to be a minimum size of gap between the um, uh, the so basically the spindles. So generally speaking, a stairs has things called spindles, and these are little vertical things which hold up the banister, the handrail, should I say. And what's going on here is that this is 1970s thing. So this is all pretty congruent with the overall story of this property, that it had extensive renovation in the 70s, which makes sense. So 40 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. And this was very typical of the 70s, in fact. And building regulations allowed it. But the issue was you got these big gaps. And if you've got a little child messing about or whatever, a little baby, they can stick their head through the gap, fall down, hurt themselves, or even worse. So building regulations changed this and said that you cannot have a single gap wider than 100 millimeters on a staircase banister. So what's the upshot? Well, the way building regulations work is that if a property has a feature like this, and it was acceptable under building regulations at the time, then it can't be retroactively changed. In other words, you can't demand that it gets changed unless it gets renovated and replaced or whatever. So to renovate it, so if the property gets fully renovated and this whole lot has to come out, then it has to meet current building regs. But actually, as it stands, it doesn't have to meet current building regs. But the question is, do you do something about it? And it's probably worth sorting it out, either by putting more vertical pieces in or another strip of wood to make the gap smaller. But this is something you would talk to the builder about and get their opinion on. But essentially, it's a hazard. But you may not care. If it was me, would I care? If it was £300 to just sort it out, I think I would, because what I don't want is a liability claim from a parent saying your property was dangerous, my little child fell down, hurt themselves, and we're suing you. And you know, a rental property has to be fit for purpose, the purpose being renting out and it being safe. So I guess I would sort it out. They're just talking about a lack of smoke detectors, but that's an easy thing to sort out. You can get these portable ones for like £5 a piece, and you just put a battery in, stick them in there, and then when they start beeping, you replace the battery, and it's just a task for the tenant to deal with. They're just saying hadn't seen any certificates, but yeah, this is typical. And saying it's got a combi boiler, this is good. So overall, I would say that this is a pretty decent survey. It's all come out reasonably well. There are no issues that I don't think there are any serious issues here. And I just want to check one more thing. Yeah, so there is a bit of damp, but it's elevated and there's no mold on the walls. So for me, the big telltale sign is there water staining on the walls? There isn't. I didn't see any in the survey report. So overall, I think this property is in reasonably good condition. There's nothing major to do in it, except maybe the banisters and maybe a little painting and decorating. And there was some issues, I think, from memory with the double glazing. So, but that's an easy job. So what are we talking about in renovation cost? Possibly £2,000 maximum. Just because it doesn't really need an awful lot of painting and decorating. It's just more safety and windows. Okay, I hope that helps. Thank you.